Hi there, it's Ian here, and you're watching Grumpy Opinions, the show where I'm going to tell you all about what I think of films, TV shows, games, and life in general. Outlander is a show set in the 18th century, following the extended family of Claire and Jamie Fraser, time-crossed lovers and the linchpin of the story. Episode 8, Famous Last Words, kicks off back in the 1960s, and Roger's hard at work in Oxford marking students' papers about famous last words, and he's talking about burying the hatchet, which I'm sure won't be important later at all. He's basically showing off a little bit because Brianna's come and get all moony-eyed over him, and they're off to see a silent movie marathon later on, and he gives her like a poetic set of final words, and she asks him, "Do you think those would really be your proper final words?" And he thinks. But we get into the episode proper, and it's all done in a kind of silent movie style flashback of him getting cut down from the tree, and absolutely no shocks, turns out he's alive, and Claire does one of those throat stabby breathe tube things that everyone does in films. And then boom, we're like back with him 3 months later and he's healed up a bit, but he still isn't talking, and he's been kind of a moody type and having flashbacks, and it's really worrying Brianna because it reminds her of the Vietnam vets that she met back in Boston, and they all had PTSD, or as they call it, war neurosis, or
shell shock.
But the shell shock just won't let up, and apart from a tiny moment when he ends up yelling at Jemmy not to burn his hand on a pot, but it's still not enough to actually fully break through. So he wades into like the DIY job in the loft that he'd been planning since episode 1, but he keeps having flashbacks and little things set him off. And not even Parsley can get through to him, and she probably makes things a wee bit worse by playing tarot cards and keeps drawing the hanged man. And even when he's left alone, he just can't bring himself to actually sing properly. And the first glimmer of hope comes when Brianna makes him like a wee paper airplane, and he actually pops it in his bag and keeps it because he's off on a wee trip. And that's because back at the Ridge, other things have been happening. Like Jocasta and Jamie have been mutually lamenting the death of Murtaugh, and on top of that he's still got like the issues of guilt about that, and sending off Roger and him getting hanged, and basically trying to make sense of the fact that Tryons tried to make up to everybody by giving them 500 acres of land, so he's got to get on top of that. And luckily though, things cheer up a wee bit because they get surprised by a boar in the wild, and wee Ian appears and he saves them from it. And he's come back from the far away with the Mohawks, all native and cool and got tattoos on his face and everything. But he's come back a wee bit stoic and quiet, and he's clearly not entirely himself, or anything like the lad he used to be. So after a kind of awkward dinner, they suggest that he goes off with Roger to try and map out the Tryon land and make it all official. So the pair of them head out to the woods and fields and try to get along a wee bit, but between Moody Ian and Silent Roger it's a wee bit difficult. But finally Roger reaches his breaking point when he's standing on a cliff top and he looks at Brianna's paper plane, and he chooses life, and remembers that the last thing that he saw when he was hanging was her. But things aren't quite as good for Ian, who plans to go and off himself with some hemlock that he stole from Claire's surgery, but Roger's having none of that, and finally actually manages to talk, and he drags out from Ian that it's all something to do with a woman, but not much more than that. So Roger points out that death isn't actually an escape, and him and Ian have a wee bonded moment over their shared misery. And when they get back home, Roger speaks to Brianna, and he promises no matter what that he'll sing to her, always. Aww. So what did I think? Well, it's been about 2 weeks. 2 weeks of lockdown since the last episode. And I don't know about anyone else, but I've actually been missing the show. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I haven't had other things to do. I've not been climbing the walls. You might have noticed that I did a wee video about films that I've seen recently. There'll be a link at the end. Check that out if you want. But it's also good that we finally got a resolution for the cliffhanger, or the tree hanger, as it was. Now, I'm not surprised at all that Roger's still alive. I said last time, for various reasons, that he was still going to be alive, and there had to be more than a few people talking online about him not being dead, and it's been a long 2 weeks, so just saying. Kind of knew that he wasn't dead. But this week was a really interesting episode. It was kind of curiously done. It was sort of low-key, because, it was after all the war and death of last time, and it felt a little bit more like the family coming together. And it was interesting because it was another Roger-centric episode. It was even more so than last week, which was kind of named after him. But the only difference is this time we actually got to spend time with him, even though he barely said anything for most of the episode. But I really appreciate the work that Richard Rankin did here in the quiet moments. Showing the kind of depth of his trauma and his worries, but I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But firstly, I'd actually like to commend the show on its being an episode where all the main players were really Roger and wee Ian. Everybody else was in it, but they were only in it in fits and starts, and that's not how this show usually works. Usually it's all about Jamie and Claire, and then Brianna doing a plot at something and Roger being rubbish at something. But in this week, it was really very much just about these two guys, and everybody else just running that storyline in the background. And it gave everybody a little moment to shine, but without trying to swamp everything by having subplots and narratives about everything. Except for Fungus, because apparently nobody has anything for him to do this season other than sit around in the background or have the odd line and do nothing. But yeah, We did get some understandable angst and frustration from Bree. We got like Jamie's lingering sadness and his worries. We had Claire like trying to do her doctor bit with Roger, and then actually trying to support Bree and Jamie in their woes. And we had Parsley mucking about with tarot cards. And she also got to have that wee chat with Ian about family in the past, and that felt very natural and very real. But I know we all like totally stand Parsley and Lauren Lyle, but I kind of felt there was a hint that either she knew a little bit more than what she was letting on, like a little intuition as to like being why he was being sad. I mean, not that she knew what has happened, but she could clearly tell something was up, and you got that sense from her that she's got a switched on character. Although I did think she would have known better than to like actually leave the Hanged Man cards in the tarot deck, unless she was actually trying to like break him out of his fug. But that didn't really tie in with how it played out. And overall, I liked that this was quite a quiet and calm episode. I mean, it had a break in the action. It wasn't all about doom and shock and intrigue. And it was just kind of like a snatched little moment of, during this period when things are a bit quieter, things have boiled ahead, and this is when one character had a revelation and used that to get through to another one. It was kind of classic drama stuff. And also props to the show for how much singing went on this week. I mean, we had Maria Doyle Kennedy giving it laldy at the beginning, which makes sense because she's like a legitimate real life singer and musician. I mean, she was actually in the Commitments. Yeah, people know that, right?
Baby, they don't know that I'd leave you if I could.
Okay. Anyway, we got a wee reprise of like last week's My Darling Clementine. And I totally spirited go over that for like Sophie Skelton in the episode, and then at the end of them, her and Roger did a big duet. Now, I thought that was really nice. And sure, I mean, it's all a wee bit on the nose, the song choice, but I liked it. It wasn't quite as up there as like the hanging tree on the Hunger Games, but okay. But one thing I really appreciated this week was the show's portrayal of the PTSD. Now, this is a show that's never really shied away from stuff like that, and we had essentially a whole episode about it in season 1, and they repeatedly brought back Brianna's trauma after she got raped by Stephen Bonnet. But again, it was maybe a little bit on the nose having her literally spell that out in dialogue to draw a parallel, but it was also classic drama, and it felt like what the character would probably say. But ultimately, this might have been a bit of a soap opera episode in some ways, but it was well done. We know these characters. We don't need everybody to have a subplot. We don't need everybody to have something to do. I mean, ironically, one of the very few minor issues I had with the plot was that they felt the need to have as many Claire and Jamie moments as they had, which again feels like it's because it's Claire and Jamie, they've got to be doing something. I mean, they weren't bad moments, they were slightly tacked on though, and I felt they didn't really need to be there. But again, we've not only got Roger peering inward in his flashbacks when he's confronted with the feeling material and hearing the song that he sang the same morning. I mean, he's a man deep in trauma, and it's literally made him go mute. And at first I thought, oh God, I hope it's not one of these things where he's just not talking, and then magically he's just going to talk at the right moment. And although that's kind of the case, it didn't feel like it was done too bad. Because the thing is, right, it's not how trauma-based mutism actually works, at least as far as I know. Because you see, all of this reminded me of one of my favourite movies, and it's a wee Scottish film not very well known called Regeneration. Although if you live in some parts of America or Canada, I think it was released as Behind the Lines. And it's a historical film set just during World War One, and it's about the famous poets Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, who in real life met up at Craiglockhart Mental Hospital when they were both locked up there with shell shock. And the film's also about their psychiatrist, Dr. William Rivers. He's this guy who deals with all the war neurosis, and he's played by Jonathan Pryce, Oscar Award-nominated guy from The Two Popes. And one of his patients has actually become mute. In fact, quite a few of them have, but the one in focus is the guy from Elementary and Trainspotting, Johnny Lee Miller. And a lot of the film is him talking about the psychological issues and treatments of shell shock, and some of which are portrayed are actually a lot less humane than others.
I watched him treat a man for mutism. The only way he could protest. Sat there and watched his silence being taken away from him.
And the point I'm making is that these aren't simple psychological things or something you can snap somebody out really easily. And I do appreciate that the show goes to some effort to make sure that it's not just as simple as that. And in a way, it's kind of related to that, the first thing that I had a slight issue with in this episode. Because you see, it's all well and good to look into depression and suicidal ambition and highlight the fact that it's not all as clear-cut and easy to get over. But while, as I've said, Outlander is great at showcasing trauma and PTSD as a real and present condition, it's got a slight problem when it comes to it, that it's the moment where the drama meets the healthy and realistic portrayal of mental illness. I mean, I've complained a little bit about it in previous seasons. I mentioned it in season 1, I mentioned it in season 4, especially where there are scenes where characters are just shouting other characters out of depression. And like mental illness and trauma is something that you can't really shame and reason somebody out of in a minute or a day. And I'm sure, right, when it comes to like Jamie in the show, I mean, I'm not completely ragging on it because they spent a significant chunk of season 2 with him getting over the trauma of his assault from Blackjack. And nearly a full season later, Brianna still isn't over what happened to her at the hands of Stephen Bonnet. I mean, they're still working on that and they're still showing up in the plot. But in both cases, there were scenes in the show. I mean, originally first Claire, and then later on in the later season, Jamie end up literally shaming and yelling somebody into getting over the problem. Now, I mean, I don't know how much of that's from the book, how much of it comes from the show. It's kind of a bad look though, and it's not really healthy. And while I appreciate that herself might well be an academic, although apparently her field is in zoology and marine biology, I mean, she's not a psychologist, and it kind of shows. And you think the showrunners would work around that because they've worked on some aspects of the things in the writing and changed them a little bit. And yeah, these books are kind of a little bit old now, and people are a little bit more, even in the last 5 or 10 years, much more knowledgeable about this kind of thing in mental illness. But I'm not decrying it. I got to point out because it's a bugbear of mine. And as well as that said, this week had an awful lot of really kind of on the nose stuff. I mean, nothing quite as Ian literally burying a hatchet. I mean, that was a little bit okay. But I mean, interestingly enough, burying a hatchet isn't actually about giving up or about putting your weapon away, technically. I mean, it's symbolic of agreeing to peace after a conflict. And the show didn't really make sense of that from what he said. I mean, kudos to them. You know, it is actually like an Iraqi, like, you know, a Mohawk custom. And that's where we get the term from. That was what they used to do. But if the show was trying to point out that he'd misunderstood that, then it didn't really do that very well. And clearly, like, he's in a bad place, you know, but it sounds like he's in a bad place because he got dumped or something. Or maybe he fancied some lassie who's another guy's wife. And I'm sure they're going to explain this a little bit later on. I mean, you don't need to tell me in the comments exactly what happened if they're going to show it later on. But at least I hope there is a reason to it, because otherwise, if they just never bring it up again, yikes. But I don't really get the sense of any impending import of this, unless, as I said, it's clearly being saved up for something later down the line. But at this point, I kind of wanted more, literally in this moment, just to pin this in, even if they were going to like follow up on later on. And also, I just got to be honest, I didn't really like the silent movie stuff. I mean, I got what they were doing, and you can use that, sure, and it was an interesting choice. But after a while, it was starting to detract. I mean, I kind of wanted to actually just see the stuff in color with the actual sound, and yeah, it's just not what I would have gone for. But as I said, it wasn't a bad episode. I really liked most of it fine. I'm glad the show took a bit of a different gear from last time, and ironically, during such a strange time in the world, it was kind of fitting. So yeah, till next time, I've been Ian, and these have been my grumpy opinions. And final shout out to my amazing wee pal, Michelle Forbes, who stepped up to being a top tier patron. Thanks so much. It really means an awful lot to me. You take care now.